the most revered former Chief Justice of India, Honorable Shri M N Venkatachaliah, Dr. Ramaswamy, Mr. S Murthy, Mr. Sreenath, and the very distinguished members of the audience. I must confess that it's somewhat of an intimidating prospect that I have to speak on this occasion, not only because it's a daunting challenge to speak in the presence of as eminent a personality as the former Chief Justice of India, but also I am aware of the fact that many people who are assembled here probably know much more about Sir M. Visvesvaraya than a comparatively young person like me can claim to know. But I have been trapped in this situation thanks to one of my weaknesses, which is now and then visiting Mr. Murthy's bookstop and then trying to get some valuable books from him. Some years ago, I came across this great book by Sir M.V., Planned Economy for India. Again, the source was Mr. S Murthy himself, I think. At that time, I was working as Principal Secretary in the Department of Rural Development. As Dr. Ramaswamy mentioned, I'm a student of economics. And a book on Planned Economy for India, published in 1934, long before we could launch our 5-year plans, was, I thought, at least of historical interest. When I went through that book, I found that it was not merely a book of historical interest. It was of great contemporary relevance. It was not merely of great contemporary relevance for the country as such, but for everybody who was in one way or the other associated with development of this country, including civil servants like me. I have read and reread this book a few times with great benefit, because the kind of insights that you come across in this book are astounding indeed. And one always heard of Sir M. Visvesvaraya as a great engineer, a great statesman, outstanding administrator. One hadn't heard a great deal about Visvesvaraya the economist, even though his work was known. But somehow literature on Indian economics only makes a brief mention of Sir M.V.'s contribution on this. In this respect, I think not much justice has been done to him, at least not till today. Today you have a work written by Mr. Sreenath, exclusively dealing with the economic thought of Sir M. Visvesvaraya. I think this is the beginning of a process of correcting that little injustice that was done to Sir M. Visvesvaraya. Because I feel, as a student of economics, there is a great deal for not only professors of economics, students of economics, but also planners in this country to dive into the numerous thoughts, numerous insights that are available in his great works of not only Planned Economy for India, but also other smaller works like Reconstruction of India, and many other small tracts that he published from now and then. What are these ideas which I found relevant to the present context? Because my brief today is to speak about the contemporary relevance of some of the ideas of Sir M. Visvesvaraya, particularly economic ideas. When he became the chief engineer of the state of Mysore, one of the first notable things he did was to establish something called the Mysore Economic Conference. What has a chief engineer got to do with an economic conference? But he didn't come here only to design dams or canals or plan for industries or roads. He came here to ensure the overall development of Mysore state and then develop it as a model for the rest of India. He had a couple of times declined the offer of a service under the government of Mysore, and only when he was ready and when he thought there was a certain level he had reached in Bombay province, he agreed to come here on terms which were entirely his own. He said, if I am permitted to work for industrial development, general social advancement, economic development, educational advancement of Mysore state, then I am ready to come and join Mysore service, even though he was only being asked to be the chief engineer of Mysore state. So therefore, it was not very difficult for him to persuade the then Maharaja to start this Mysore Economic Conference. I would commend that some of you go through the speeches he has delivered at the Mysore Economic Conference as early as 1911, 1912, 1913. You would find that the speeches contain astounding, somewhat audacious comparisons between the Indian situation and more advanced countries. In one of his speeches, he goes on to say, the population of Mysore state and the political situation is comparable to the population and political situation of Canada and Australia. So don't compare the prospects of Mysore with the prospects of this or that neighboring country or state. Let's see how many people are there in Canada. Mysore population is comparable. Australia is comparable. Now what are the differences? Now those are the differences we must really address. The literacy level in Mysore at that time was about 8%. Only about 8 or 10% of the children were in school at that time. The per capita income of people in Mysore was probably 1/50th of what was there in Canada or Australia. But here, this person had the audacity to dream of taking Mysore to the level of Australia or Canada, because they said they are British dominions. We are also virtually getting the dominion status under the British, so we should be able to catch up with them sooner or later. And what is it that we need to do that? His analysis of the situation prevailing in India is something extremely original. You see, you have heard this very common statement that India is an agricultural country. In fact, this morning I opened a website on Indian economy. The first sentence is India is a predominantly agricultural country. This is one thing which Sir M. Visvesvaraya thought should be changed. At that time, 90% of the people were living in villages. About 80% of the people living in the villages were in agriculture. So totally, there was something like 73% according to statistics. And Sir M. Visvesvaraya was very, very fond of digging up precise statistics and using them in his analysis. 73% of country's population is in agriculture. And he said there has been a progressive ruralization of India. He said 30 years earlier, there were only 60% of Indian population in agriculture. Then it became 70%, then it became 73%. Progressively, this country is becoming more and more rural. And he quotes several Western authorities to say that any country which is so rural will remain backward. Any country which remains dependent on agriculture cannot advance. Today, it's very easy to accept this proposition or debate this proposition. For someone to say this in the first half of 20th century really called for a great deal of insight into the workings of an economy. And he goes on to give the examples of United States, United Kingdom, Japan. All these countries had a small proportion of their population working in agriculture, whereas only India had more than 70% of the people working there. This was an extremely revealing kind of thought which I came across. And then you go and scan the current economic literature on this subject. Every single economist who works on development agrees with this proposition today. As recently as 2010, our present Reserve Bank governor, who was earlier then a professor in University of Chicago, he came and delivered a talk in Bangalore. I think this was on 31st October 2010. And he said, shift focus from low productivity farming to industry. This is a headline which I preserved from the Hindu dated 2nd August 2010. And here was an eminent economist saying this in 2010, something which Sir M Visvesvaraya argued for in virtually 100 years earlier. He said the most important challenge for us is to see that people who are now dependent on agriculture are brought outside agriculture, are employed in industry. This is virtually the main theme in his book, Planned Economy for India. Not that, he despised agriculture or anything like that, but given the situation of Indian agriculture, it was not possible for people to become prosperous, for the nation to become prosperous, being so heavily dependent on agriculture.